There's something else I was thinking of. Oh, do pray for the Starkweathers as they have their house on the market, that they would find some buyer that would be interested there. So pray for that as well. And then pray for a number of folks who are out of town. Okay, let's head over to 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1. And the title here this morning, The End of a Long Road, and the sense of that is David finally becomes king, as we'll see in this passage here today. And that was a number of years, 7 or 8 years, I believe it was, since he was anointed as a young man. In fact, it was probably a little more than that. He was probably late teens then when he was anointed as a shepherd. And then I think it says at age 30 he was, or age, I'm trying to remember now. He reigned for 40 years. I can't remember. I think it said 30 when he started, but I'm not sure on that. So we think about it. Okay, so let's begin. Let's read verses 1 through 5 in 2 Samuel 1. Someone like to read that for us here this morning? So 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Okay, I'm not sure whose hand this Brother Krinky, I think I saw yours first. Okay, we'll stop there, and we already prayed, so let's just jump into this here this morning. Just a question to start off. What's the key of showing patience? So think, you need to show patience. Now, it won't be quite probably the same way David did, but we'll start it there. What are some keys showing patience, whether it is going downtown Seattle about 7 to 9 a.m. in the morning, or if it's your light pole that has gone out and there's no electricity and no phone for a day until 4 or 5 o'clock that evening. So what gives you patience? You have a neighbor that's just really irritating you, or a coworker, So what's a key to showing patience? Anybody? Yes, Don? The peace of the Lord. Okay, so good. So having a peace from God that really passeth understanding. Anybody else? Yes, Arden?
This too shall pass.
Okay, so this is not eternity. This is, and it passes in time as well. So you can be patient. Good. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Yes, Brother Krinky? Okay, the Lord is allowing it for good purposes. Well, those are all great answers. So I just put maybe summarize some of that, except maybe Don's on the peace of the Lord. But wait on the Lord. You focus on heavenward, and that seemed to be for all three of those answers there. I just put trust God when our plans do not work, when we hope they would, or how we expected them. Okay, we often have plans, we have expectations, and all of a sudden something happens that throws that out of whack. And it's not as we hoped it would be, or it's not when we hoped it would be. Something else takes place, and all of a sudden we need to stop a moment and say, okay, I got to trust God here. And that was involved in all your answers. So, yeah, amen for that. So even as after the death of Saul, David had to show patience and wisdom when taking the throne. There was just some things that take place, we'll see here, that I thought, wow, this is It's almost, I'll say this tongue in cheek because it wasn't better, but it was almost better to dwell in the wilderness than what he faced now that he was on the verge of coming to the throne. I mean, it is really full of intrigue and espionage and all that kind of stuff was going on. So it's so the final chapters of 1 Samuel, because we were a couple weeks ago. So David, remember, his men lived in Ziklag. It had been given to him by Achish, king of Gath. Remember, he went there to finally just fled Israel. And so they had gone, now I say they, David and his men had gone to fight with the Philistines against Israel, but the Philistine commanders rejected them, said, no, we can't have them go. So upon their return home, they found Ziklag burned with fire and their families taken. And so they pursued the Amalekite marauders and recovered everyone and everything, plus some more. And they shared those spoils, that surplus with the towns in southern Judah. So we looked at all of that last time. And then just some other things. The Philistines won the battle and killed King Saul and his sons. This fulfilled Samuel's prophecy given when the demonic medium at Endor tried to contact the dead prophet. She didn't do it, but God did. He was the one that brought Samuel for that final prophecy, really, against King Saul, in a sense. So the Philistines sent Saul's head, and probably his sons too, because they're not really mentioned, but probably them too, because we don't find them connected with their bodies later on. But and his armor, the king's armor, at least the main parts of it, to major, but not all of it, which is interesting because we'll see something about that here today. To the major Philistine cities for celebrations. They also made announcements of victory in the idol temples, obviously crediting their false god with the win in the battle. So that, I mean, there's all this celebration going on because of that. They also hung the bodies of Saul and his sons, and maybe his sons' bodies still had their heads on the wall of Bashan. When known, the men of Jabesh Gilead retrieved them, honored them with a proper ceremony and burial. I found this one map, and I thought, oh, this is good. This is a little hard to see, but I'll just read it. So, beginning of the battle, the Philistines muster their forces at Aphek and advance to Shunem. So that's up here, Shunem. Okay, and then the Israelites set up camp. Why don't we turn these front lights off there, Zach, if we could? Maybe that would help a little bit. So the Israelites set up camp in Jezreel, and the night before the battle, Saul consults the medium in Endor. So remember, it was around the other side of the camp from where the Philistines were. And then number 3 there, the battle begins, and many Israelites retreat to the slopes of Gilboa, Mount Gilboa, there it is. And so here is the elevated area. So they flee this way. That's where Saul and his sons were killed. After that, the bodies of Saul and his sons were hung on the walls of Bethshan. Here's Bethshan. And here the men of Jabesh Gilead traveled through the night to recover the bodies of Saul and his sons. So here's Jabesh Gilead. They had to go quite a ways. Perhaps the repayment of Saul's rescue of the town from the Ammonites years earlier. Remember when Saul first became king and the Ammonites came against Jabesh Gilead and said, let us take out your right eyes and you'll be our servants forever. And they said, well, give us a day or so before we decide on this. And so that's when Saul came there and defeated the Ammonites on behalf of Jabesh Gilead. So they never lost their eyes, never went into servitude. So that's really the situation. So now we come to, so that was how 1 Samuel ends. So 2 Samuel begins. David and his men and his families have returned from Ziklag. So remember, after they got their families back. So 3 days later, a man comes from the war, and that's in those first 3 days. I thought about this. This is interesting. Remember, so David and his men go from Ziklag. They go to be with the Philistine commanders, which was probably a day or two. They go up with them, and then the commanders say, hey, David can't come. So he's traveling back, and he finds out that Ziklag's been burned. And I thought, if David had gone to battle, which God sovereignly stopped that, but if he had, there would have been, 3 or 4 more days that his family had been taken captive, and what a mess that would have been. Whether, every day with those Amalekites, I think it would have been worse off for the families, and whether they'd be sold into slavery or more horrible things physically and so forth. So anyway, what does the man report to David? in verse number 4, so that we read this already. Okay, more than Saul's been killed. More than that. More than that. Yeah, the army fled, and what did they say? One else, not only did they flee, but they something else. Yeah, so we're talking about, the majority of the Israel's armies. I don't know if majority, that may not be the right, but many of them had fallen down dead. The rest of them fled. Saul and Jonathan were dead. And what was David's main concern, which you guys already mentioned, but it's in verse 5. What it seems to be the greatest concern of what he said? Yeah, how do you know? How do you know? And then the guy gives a story, and I'll just summarize it up here. The man told David that he had come upon Saul trying to kill himself with a spear. He said he took Saul's life at Saul's request. I think that's important to note. And then grabbed the crown and the royal armband and brought them to David. Okay, so he's there. He sees Saul. His story is that Saul was trying to kill himself. And the guy came along, and Saul requested, hey, take out my life. There's not much left in me. I can't remember if that's how it's said here. And so he did, and then he grabbed Saul's crown and his sort of royal armband and brought those to David. So what do you think? This is not in the text, but what do you think the man, and he was an Amalekite, was hoping for when he shared the story about King Saul to David? What do you think he was looking for? Reward. Hey, look at it. You're to be the king. I'm bringing you all the stuff. So here's the next question I want to ask you. What really happened? Let's go back. Let's go back and look what really happened. Okay, so 1 Samuel, just back at chapter there, 31, verses 3 through 5. So what's the first thing that happened in the battle in verse 3? Okay, so Saul, and it says sore wounded, so he's dying. He's got life in him yet, but he's dying. So then what happens next? Okay, so he asks his armor bearer to kill him so that he won't be made fun of by the uncircumcised Philistines, and they come and abuse him. And so what did his armor bearer tell him? It's in that same verse there, a little bit later in the verse. Okay, and then what happened? Yeah, Saul killed himself, fell on his sword, he died. Now, verse number 5, the verification of his death. And when his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he likewise fell upon his sword and died with him. Okay, now notice, died with him. Saul was hit by archers, fell on his own sword. His armor bearer would not leave his side unless he was dead. Okay, that was the armor bearer's responsibility. I am to keep the king alive. If he's not alive, then I'm free of my responsibility in a sense. Okay, so that's what happened. Okay, that's the real story. That's given in the narrative. He said, well, how do we know the first narrative is true and the second narrative? Because the second narrative is not just a narrative, it's the Amalekites' story about what happened. Okay, so here's what I think was happening, and I can't say this for sure. One thing I do know, Saul's armor bearer would not have allowed the story of the Amalekite to have taken place. In other words, if Saul even had a little bit of life and a guy came up and was talking to King Saul and Saul said, hey, buddy, would you kill me? And his armor bearer would have stepped in. He said, you can't take my king. I don't care how weak he is. I don't care how close to death he is. You don't touch him. And his armor bearer would have taken out this guy, before. So we know as long as his armor bearer was alive, you say, well, maybe Saul fell on his sword and he wasn't dead. Well, the narrative says he died with him. He died with him. So that does tell us So I think he was probably in there taking spoils from the dead when he came upon the king. So he made up the story in hopes, as Brother Arden mentioned, getting honor and benefits from the new king. So this guy was a liar. That's how I look at it. Because the first story seems to be that which is true. And so obviously looking for reward there. So thinking about, there was let me see. So what happened to the guy in verses 15 and 16 here? Someone read 15 and 16 for us. Someone want to do that? You want to just read them for us? You want to just read them? Read the two, 15 and 16.
And David called one of the young men and said, Go near and fall upon him. And he smote him that he died. And David said unto him, Thy blood be upon thy head, for thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed.
So in David's mind, he still killed the king. You know, that was the issue. That's always been the issue for David all through this. And I thought it's interesting. Just remember, when you lie, you get a tangled web and you can't untangle it, and it may cost you more than if you told the truth. If the guy had just said, hey, I was there and I came upon the king, he was dead, his armor bearer was dead, I grabbed his crown and I brought this to you. And maybe it would have been far different for him, but I think he was trying to say, I took him out, king. I took him out, David. So anyway, coming that. Any questions or comments on that? I just think it's an interesting scenario. I know you could try to piece them together. I just think the first one says the end, and the second one is a story that someone made up about that. But any other thoughts? Okay. So what did David and his men do when they heard about Israel's defeat by the Philistines? There in 11 and 12. Right, and then it says in verse 12, in addition to that, they mourned, which would go with that, and wept and fasted until even. So they were overwhelmed, and especially that was for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel. So David, he was just ripped apart, and the men, when they found out, hey, Israel was defeated, the army was defeated, I'm sure they had some friends there. Some friends and companions that they knew that were still in the army, that weren't following David, that were still loyal to Saul, but they weren't necessarily enemies. And so all of that. So this struck me as I was thinking that, what does that show about David's heart during his 16 months with the Philistines? Yeah, he seemed to be still loyal back to Israel and all that's going on there. Though I think it was a spiritually low time for him because of that part we looked at. He didn't seek the Lord as much as he had previously. But I just think it was God was working, and God was still loyal to Israel. He didn't want to leave Israel, though he was siding with the Philistines, and I guess he sort of got himself into some conflict there as he went through. But any other thoughts on that as far as David's heart during those months he was with the Philistines? So maybe, again, I can't see what David, again, like I said last time, maybe the Philistine generals were correct when they told Achish, David's going to go into battle, and what better way to get in right with his king? And of course, that was a whole other story they didn't know all that about, but what a better way to get right with the king than to get into battle and all of a sudden turn on us and take out 5 or 6 generals all in one simple swoop, with his men. So it's a difficult time. I still think it was a spiritually low time for David. But let's continue on. So 17 through 27 to the end of the chapter is David's lamentation over that. Just notice verse 17, and David lamented with lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan his son. And then verse 18, I do want to mention something here I think is interesting. And he bade them teach the children of Judah and the use of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. Now, notice the 2 words, the use of, or 3 words, I'm sorry, the use of. What is it? Do you notice? Yeah, they're italics. Yeah, and so that means that was put in there as a clarification in English. But I think if you leave it out, there's something here you could see. I want you to teach the children of Judah the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. So I make mention of that. This was not about training Judah how to use the bow, but a poem titled The Bow. I want Israel to know this poem that I've written called The Bow. Let me ask you, based on, I think it's when David was lamenting Saul and Jonathan after his death, It spoke of Saul with his sword and David with his what? His bow. And I think this is a poem in honor of Jonathan. And he said, I want everybody to know I want everybody to learn this poem. And the book of Jasher is interesting because it's mentioned back in the book of Joshua as well, and I didn't write down the reference. But it seems to be a book that was, okay, here's some historical realities, some historical things that people need to know. And so they just wrote it. It was like an encyclopedia, I guess, or some kind of historical authority. And so I think that's what where it was written. The refrain through this, and you can read it later, just we don't have time, but how are the mighty fallen? And that's in 19 and then 23 or 25 and 27. It's mentioned in all three of these places. So just remember to read that the beauty of Israel is slain upon the high places. High places there probably just meant the mountains, Mount Gilboa. And so that would be the high places. How are the mighty fallen? And so just going through this, 21 and 22 is a great lament over the Philistine celebrations. You know, David said, oh man, they're celebrating, about the victory over Saul and Jonathan. And then this last half of 21 through 24, both Saul and Jonathan were skillful and accomplished. Both brought benefits to the nation. Let me just read this. Hard, I know it's, let me just start in the middle of, let me start in 21. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offering. In other words, because the Philistines are rejoicing over this, may this ground be cursed for what happened there. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. And so he's just exalting Saul and Jonathan, and he says everybody needs to weep for the king because he blessed you. He made your lives better than what it was before. He clothed you, and so there's a lot of poetry there. I think it's very... What is interesting about this line, do you think? In the middle of verse 22, it says, the bow of Jonathan turned not... Now, that's not the one. Let me see. It's somewhere else. Oh, I'm sorry. Now I can't find my phrase I was going to use. Let me see. Oh, okay. In verse number 23, it says, and in their death they were not divided. Why is that an interesting phrase, thinking of Jonathan? His bow turned not back, they were not divided. You're thinking of of Jonathan and Saul and their relationship. Yeah, I think that's... So he was just saying, and I think it went a little farther. I think Jonathan knew that his father was against David, and David and him obviously were covenant companions, and yet he still recognized him as his king, his father, and he honored him all the way to death. And I thought, wow, that's really something. That really shows you Jonathan was a man filled with God's grace, his grace in recognizing David as the coming king and his loyalty to David, and yet still his loyalty to his father. Honor thy father and mother, honor the king. And so he did all of that together, the best he could, trying to trying to navigate through those difficult relationships. And so I just think that's a great thing. And really the last part I did want to read, and really this is where it really gives a personal tribute to Jonathan. And I want to clarify something that's been used in a horrible way in these days. But verse 25, how are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thy high places. Again, high places speak of mountains. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Now, just to know how perverted the minds of humanity can be, what do you think some have used when David's mentioned their last couple phrases of verse 26? What group do you think have used that? Yeah, homosexuals. There's nothing to do with that this is talking about. Zero, zilch. It doesn't even, what he's speaking about there is how Jonathan was such a friend, a loyal companion, one who gave himself for David. I just put loyalty, friendship, counselor, spiritual helper, same thing, I guess, encourager, just always there to, here was, and I think part of what he says is his passing the love of women. Jonathan showed a sacrifice of his rightful position as becoming king. And he said, David, you're the one who's going to be king, and I'll be right next to you, supporting you, uplifting you, following your cause, promoting your will as God is directing you. And so yeah, I think that's important. I think most of you would understand that. But yeah, it's just, there's so many, our world is so corrupt now. And I know that I've said this before. I probably won't mention it this morning in the message, but there was a couple statements I've read either from political or political leaders or people in the entertainment industry. I'm thinking of one right now that formerly a movie and, that type of industry, but also then was in a political power, how they vilify the Word of God, the truth about Jesus Christ, the reality of heaven, all those things. So, as I said, false prophets may never enter a pulpit. They have a pulpit, it's called Twitter. They have a pulpit, it's called, Facebook. They have a pulpit, it's called the internet. It's called social media. It's called, just media in general. That they are promoting things that say the Bible's not true, going to heaven is a lie, Jesus Christ was no sense any different from you and me, and those kind of things. Those are blasphemous. And so just how they pervert that thing. Anyway, so just a thought here. At this moment in time, just thinking about verse 27, how are the mighty fallen and the weapons of war perished? As far as David knew at this moment in time, Saul and his sons are probably still out on the field, lying dead, with their armaments around them. And just, it's just a sad, sad situation there. Okay, any questions or comments on that? Yes, sir.
It's just, to me, it's a matter of not having a word in English, I suppose, that is enough to describe love. We have this one word that's used
Good.
for so many aspects of life that it gets lost as to what love, real love, God's love is.
Yeah, amen.
It's just that sacrificial love that God showed in John 3:16.
Amen. Yeah, for those, if you didn't hear that, Arden was just sharing that the term love that we have in English, it's limited to the gamut of what the Bible talks about love, and he mentioned John 3:16 and that sacrificial love, and that's really what I think David's focused on here, that his friend was sacrificial for his needs. Okay, I got that all down. Okay, so David's reign begins, chapter 2. We're not going to get through all this. We'll go as far as we can. So Saul is gone. Prophecies clearly declare that David is to be king. What is the first thing now that David does that Saul is dead in verse number 2? Yeah, yes. I'm sorry, I cut you off, Don. Go ahead. Yeah, so he's asking, Lord, what do you want me to do? I'm waiting on you. And again, this shows he's waiting on the Lord. Do you want me shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah? And the Lord said, go up. And he says, where do you want me to go? And he says, go unto Hebron. And so that's where David goes. So then I'm not going to read the down through verse 4, but the leaders of the tribe of Judah. Remember, Judah's in the south, and I'll show you a map in just a moment. Maybe it's the next slide. So the leaders of Judah come there and anoint him. So just so you get an idea, the Philistines really, after this battle with, remember, and part of their probably this stretches out this way, but they have really dominated the coastline very much so. And by the way, what's the present term that is used in our world to call this land? It's not Philistia, but it's related to it. Yeah, it's, well, starting with a P. Palestine. Yeah, it came from that same root. So it's still around after all these years. So remember, here's Ziklag. And so David and his men, they head over. God said, go up to Hebron. So he does. And so the tribe of Judah, which is all this area, they come and they anoint him. The elders anoint him to be king over the southern kingdom. So now David has been anointed to be king over Judah. Okay, not Israel yet, but just over Judah. And so when David found out about the actions of Jabesh Gilead, remember they helped with the burial of Saul, so he praised them, he rewarded them, he told them that he was also anointed king now, and so things had changed, and so he's praising them for their good work toward the king. So then the next thing is civil war breaks out, the fight begins. What does Abner do? So we're in chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. So someone read, let's just read those and we'll figure out what he does. Someone like to read those this morning for us? Okay, Steve. So chapter 2, verses 8 and 9.
Abner, the son of Ner, captain of Saul's host, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to
Mahanaim. Okay, so he anoints Ishbosheth, and so David's new capital then is Hebron. The army, it mentioned up earlier there, the army of Judah is led by Joab. And then from Gibeah, that's where Saul was at. So Gibeah, he brings him Ishbosheth up here, and Mahanaim, and he anoints him to be king over the northern tribes. And really, Benjamin was sort of right in this area. Remember, Saul was from Benjamin, and his main area was Gibeah, was where he was at. So anyway, so he anoints him over the northern part. So like I said, it wasn't like Saul's dead, let's vote, David's a king, yay, and everything's done. It didn't work like that. I mean, that's why I said there was still a waiting on the Lord. There was still need for patience, still need for wisdom and guidance, because he could have divided, the kingdom could have stayed divided. And there was lots of things here that happened that could bring that. So the fight begins here. So Abner, leader of the king of Ishbosheth, and Joab, the leader of King David, met by the pool of Gibeon. Now, it doesn't really tell us why they met there. But what do they agree to in verses 14 and 15 here? So we're still in chapter 2. I'll just read these. And Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and play before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." Then there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, that was with Abner, which pertaineth unto Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. And so I just wrote down, soldiers at play. What harm could there be? So what happens at this little, these soldiers at play? Verse 16. Someone like to, just read it there. What happened? Yeah. So what's interesting, when I was reading it, I'd always thought, I thought those were the 12 servants of Saul, it's 12 servants of David, and those 12 servants caught every man his fellow by the head and thrust a sword through his fellow's side. But the next phrase says that, no, that's probably not correct. So they fell down together. Okay, he's not speaking of the 12. I think he was saying the 24. There was hand-to-hand battle going on, and pretty soon both of them killed each other. And then and so all 24 seemed to die. So what did that lead to in verse 17? Yeah, a large battle. It didn't stay between 12 and 12. And I was trying to find out pictures even today of how big this pool in Gibeon was. And it's hard to tell. There was one that's grown over. Somebody said the pools that weren't built till later. So I couldn't find out exactly. Did you ever go to the pool in Gibeon where this battle? Okay, yeah. So it was hard to find out. So maybe it was a watering hole in the sense, and there was, maybe 10, 15, 20 yards, and so one group was on one side, one on the other, and so maybe they battle off to the side, and pretty soon, one guy didn't like what another guy did to his friend, and so, whatever it was, but pretty soon it was more and more, and, so now there's this civil war going on. So just to give you an idea, and so I wrote down, so this was about 30 miles, so from up Mahanaim to get to Gibeon, about 30, and this is about, I think, somewhere between 15 and 18. So the two sides meet at the pool of Gibeon, and then all of a sudden the whole battle. So 12 of them kill each other, and then a battle breaks out. So what happened next, I didn't want to read all of this, but Joab's brother Asahel, it says he was as a deer, I think it says, on his feet. So, he was the fastest sprinter there was, and maybe a little long-term runner as well. So he chased after Abner. Abner's on his chariot. And so, like I said, it goes beyond the pool and it starts going out. And so Asahel, he's got his sword, he's chasing, or maybe he's just chasing Abner. And Abner says, turn aside, go fight somewhere else. And he told him twice. Because he said, how am I going to face your brother Joab if I kill you? And Asahel just keeps chasing him on his chariot. And so finally Abner says, he's not going to, I've told him twice to go, and he's not listening. So he takes the blunt end of his spear and rubs it through. It says below his fifth rib. And so I'm not sure, probably through his heart. And so Asahel just dies right there. And so, so that became something that's very important later on. The key is to understand Abner did not want to, but it was really for his life. It's like, Asahel was threatening him and chasing him and wouldn't turn aside, even though he asked him over and over, to turn aside there. So just keep that in mind, what happened there. So Joab and Abishai, that's Asahel's brother, they pursue Abner to the east. Finally, the generals declare a ceasefire. I was going to put ceasefire, and I thought, you know what, they don't have any guns, so I put it in quotes. A ceasefire because they were fighting against their brethren. In other words, they both said, how long is this going to be? We're going to kill our brethren. So they recognize this is a civil war. It's not what it should be. We're not fighting Philistines or Amalekites or anyone else. And so they decided to have a ceasefire at that time. So just to make note, so from Gibeon, the battle seems to go this way to the east. So Asahel, this is where he pursues Abner, and Abner forced to kill him. And then as Joab and Abishai pursue Abner, they decide to end the battle eventually. It doesn't really say where it's at, but it seems to be somewhere to the east here. And then Abner and his troops head back to King Ishbosheth, back to Mahanaim. And then at the other side of this, Joab, they come to, they bury their brother Asahel in Bethlehem, and then they come back to Hebron to see David there. So the troops have now split back up. Though the war doesn't really end, but it does, this battle apparently had come to an end, and they go their separate ways. So what was the outcome of this battle here in verse 30 and 31? I'm sorry? Yeah, and how it does tell us exactly how many. Yeah, so it's 360. And then how many did David's men lose? 20. Yeah, so 20. So 19, good job. 19 plus Asahel would be 20. I was going to say, no, it's 19. So Steve got it right there, adding it together for us. So as the fighting continues, what was happening in chapter 3, verse 1? Yeah, so the war continued, and then what was happening during that war? Yeah, so David and his side got stronger and stronger, and Saul got weaker and weaker concerning that. Let me see. I had some notes here. I'm trying to see what I was going to write about. Oh, okay. That's a little bit later. Okay, and then so the fight begins, and then the north divides as this battle keeps going. So though Ishbosheth was kingdom grew stronger, Abner, an excellent military leader, he grew in power within the kingdom. So he's a very, very powerful position. And then something happens here that really caused the division. King Ishbosheth confronted Abner about sleeping with King Saul's concubine, because this could be a sign to the nation that he was going to take charge. And so when he slept with this concubine from King Saul's concubine, which wife, in a sense, that it was a symbol or a sign to the people, I don't know how many knew about it, but it would be a symbol and sign that, hey, Abner is now taking Saul's place. And so that's why Ishbosheth confronted him and says, what are you doing? And so that did not set well with Abner. He got very angry, and after declaring Ishbosheth's ingratitude for his kindness to the kingdom, and it's in 8 through 10 there, but he just says, hey, I've showed you kindness, I've helped your father's house, I've helped you, I've delivered this land to your hand, and now what kind of gratitude do I get? And so he more or less declares to, let me just read verse number 9. So do God to Abner, and more also, except as the Lord hath sworn to David, even so will I do, to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul, and to set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah, from Dan even to Beersheba. Now Dan was way up this far north, and Beersheba was way on the south border, and so he says, I'm going to give the whole kingdom over to David. And so that's not. So what was Ishbosheth's response to this? Well, he didn't like it, but there was something more that took place. Pardon? Yeah, he feared him. I mean, he was shaking in his boots. Abner had power. Abner was good with the sword as well, and so he's trembling. He doesn't know what to do. And so Abner follows through and contacts David about bringing all Israel under David's control. And so he followed through with what he said he would do. What does David demand before this can happen? In other words, Abner said, hey, I'm going to turn the kingdom over to you. And so David says, hey, that's great, but here's something I want done before we do that. Yes? Yeah, so Michal, and we don't have to turn there, but back in 1 Samuel 25. So 26 is when David cuts off the end of Saul's robe. Or 24. 26 is where he walks into his camp at night and takes his water and his spear. And so 25 is in the middle of that. But one of those is Saul said, hey, I'm not gonna hurt you anymore. So it comes after that. And then it says that King Saul gave Michal, or Michelle, however you want to say it, to someone else. And it was like, well, what? You said David could come back, and he didn't come back, so what do? You give his wife to someone else? And I thought, wow, that's really not a good thing. I think part of this would be a similar, not quite the same as Abner with the concubine, but it would be, what did this marriage do? It made in relationship to Saul. How did it make, obviously? So it made David the son-in-law to the king. So it sort of put him into the royal family. And now that he was no longer married, the wife was somebody else's, David was no longer. And so I think there was an important symbol for the nation to know, hey, I'm not like away from that royal family. I think there was something in that. It is one of the, if you read the story, what happened because Ishbosheth decides to do that, just to cooperate, and takes Michelle and is going to bring him to David, or someone else is going to bring him there. You remember what happens during that episode? It's a really sad. Yeah, the husband he's crying out, and he's saying, what are you doing? And then finally says, you better go back home or we're going to kill you. And so he does. And yeah, it's just really really a sad situation. But anyway, so that was David. So though more of a military man, I'd say more of, though more a military man than a spiritual one. I don't know where Abner stood spiritually, but I know he was strong military. What did Abner say to the elders of Israel about David in verse 17 and 18? And you can just read it and just tell me what is, especially verse 18. Yeah, and who was the one who said that? Well, Abner said it, but who is he quoting? I think it's really important. Well, yes, but ultimately Samuel spoke for who? Who did Samuel? A prophet speaks on whose behalf? Yeah, God, okay? So I think it's interesting. He's a military man, and yet he's telling the elders, don't forget, this is what God said, that David, where is it at now? I lost my place there. We can't find it, sorry. Oh, by the hand of my servant David, I will save my people Israel out of the hand of the Philistines and out of the hand of all their enemies. And so he's more or less, he's not quoting scripture, but in a sense he is. He's quoting the God's way, and so Abner sees that, and that's an appeal to them as well. So what Abner did after that, he went down and met with David and said, hey, I got a means, we're going to turn the kingdom over to you, and David, and they have a feast and so forth. And then Abner heads back home. And then Joab was not there when that happened. So when he found out, what did Joab do first? Verse 24 and 25. Yeah. What are you doing? And what does Joab accuse Abner of to David? Yeah, he's deceived you. He's sort of a spy. He's coming in here and he's putting one over on you, David. And so he accuses Abner of being a bad guy. What did he do next? Verse 26. Right, so he calls him back, verse 26, and it says they met again from the well of Sirah, but David knew it not. So they came, the well of Sirah, they said, was about a mile north of Hebron. So he was a little bit out of town. And I think it's interesting, that last statement in verse 26. We'll close up here in a moment. That David knew it not. So this was all, David was ignorant of all that Joab was doing in relationship with Abner. And then obviously, why did Joab kill Abner? It's mentioned in verse 30, but also back in verse 27. Yeah, for his brother. And trying to get back, as it says there, the end of verse 27, for the blood of Asahel, his brother, and also verse 30. They slew at the battle there at Gibeon. So yeah, it was just a sad... So what eventually happened, David declares a curse on Saul and his descendants. I'll show you a little map and then we'll close this out. So Ishbosheth accuses Abner of immoral conduct and more. So Abner heads down to Hebron and decides to side with David, is going to turn the kingdom over to David. David celebrates the treaty with Abner. Hey, this is great. Let's move this forward. And then Joab murders Abner there, probably north of Hebron, just a little bit than that map shows. We'll just stop there. We need to quit, so we'll try to pick that up where we left off next time. But I will not be here next week, and there'll be a guest. But the following week, Rick will be teaching. So I'm going to be heading out of town. My son is moving from Cincinnati down to Oklahoma. And so we're moving him. This is the only time. And I said, hey, tell us when it works out. So selling a house in Cincinnati, moving to Oklahoma State or Oklahoma City. So anyway, we'll be gone for a couple weeks. So let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you for your goodness and grace, and just thinking how David was